Okay, let's go ahead and jump right into what we're here to talk about. I don't really want to stick up the title card right now because that's showing up on all of our failed streams, if anybody does manage to find us. We're here tonight to talk about the myth of the flat Earth.
Right. We're not here to talk about the shape of the Earth in terms of in terms of what we think it is or what tests we can use. What we're talking about tonight is why people keep talking about the flat Earth. Not just today, but it has happened over and over and over again in history. So we're going to go back to try to understand how people understood what the world was shaped like. The biggest influence as far as historians were dealing with is Jeffrey Burton Russel.
That's a modern book.
He's a very modern book called The Inventing the Flat Earth. And he got us started as to looking into this. We don't necessarily agree with everything he's going to say because, hey, we're historians.
And we have opinions.
We have opinions, and that's how life goes. But definitely, we're going to present a lot of his ideas.
So here's an image of how people in the Middle Ages perceived the Earth. This is a drawing from about the 17th century, and you can see they feared ships would sail off the edge of the Earth and be eaten by a large, biologically improbable creature.
Nope.
No, actually, this is an image that we had used in some early promotion attempts at this show by an artist named Antar Dial. He is living and working in Santa Barbara today. He's a German immigrant to America. I love the work, and I could stare at this all day, and I might just blow it up and hang it on the side of my office. But Antar Dial is, of course, most famous for his mission in life, he said, was to bring back the scratchboard as an art form.
Yeah, which is pretty nifty art form.
He's most noted for doing the Barack Obama Hope poster, which is, if you look at it, whether you didn't like Obama or not, it's pretty good art.
Yes.
Okay, but that's kind of our image of people in the Middle Ages were wandering around saying, "Here be dragons.
Yes.
We'll fall off the edge of the Earth." But I'm going to present to you the theory that this is really not very accurate for what we know about the Middle Ages.
It's not accurate, and yet the idea of someone being a flat earther is a pejorative, and that those people who believe the Earth was round are progressive thinkers or bucking the system. Do you have the Ted Cruz bit?
Not quite yet. I was going to show you something else first.
Right.
This is an educational film from 1960.
You haven't cut into it yet?
I have not started. Hang on here.
Right.
The system should work if I don't have any more audio mess ups. And I mean, fortunately, we have a small enough audience that people will just say, "Oh, that's quaint. They screwed up." All right, this is a clip we're going to show from the 1960s.
1960s.
I don't hear the audio. Okay. We're going to cut back to you. Phil for a minute while I fix the audio.
Oh, okay. This is a young people's records. It was produced for children, and it is supposed to be educational.
Could you talk for a second about this slide?
Okay. Why it matters? Well, because we have recently had a certain senator from a certain very large state, Texas, talk about himself being something of a maverick in terms of
well, here's the actual quote.
If you could find the quote, please.
The quote is, what did they do? They scream, "You're a denier." They brand you a heretic. Today, the global warming alarmists are the equivalent of the flat earthers. It used to be, it is accepted scientific wisdom that Earth is flat. And then this heretic named Galileo was branded a denier. Now, obviously, you can have whatever opinions you like about whether or not Ted Cruz is comparable to Galileo.
But his history stinks.
Galileo never in his life debated the shape of the Earth.
Nope. Didn't question it at all. He knew it was round. And of course, when you're discussing concepts like flat Earth, what automatically pops into your mind is, of course, Christopher Columbus. I mean, he sailed the ocean blue and proved the Earth was round.
Okay, but Galileo was, of course, almost 150 years after Columbus.
Easily
Galileo, of course, had the
years.
debate over geocentrism versus heliocentrism,
Right.
which
and
to me is
we're going to get into that debate.
it's harder to prove than the shape of the Earth. The shape of the Earth, there's a lot of evidence. I have a perspective. I flew in a Learjet one time at about 75,000 feet, and it sure looks like it's starting to curve. And I would have been really, really moved by it, but I was also terrified. I don't know why. You're just as dead if you fall from 100 feet.
70,000 feet.
70,000 feet, and we could see across, we were over the edge of California and Nevada. We could see the Bay Area, which is like almost 200 miles.
Yeah.
And it was quite sweeping, but it was also a little terrifying. Let's see if I can get this audio to play for you.
This video, because it's screamingly funny.
It is screamingly funny. We're going to try this again. Right here.
Fingers crossed.
The Earth was flat. Then one day, a map maker named Christopher Columbus had an idea. Do you know what? I think the world isn't flat at all. I think it's round like a ball.
Did you hear what he said? Did you hear what he said? He said that the world is round. Oh,
He's crazy man. I think the world isn't flat at all. I think it's round like a ball.
the world is flat as the brim of your hat, and that is very plain.
I know that I'm right. Oh, I know that I'm right when I say that the world is round. Oh, I'm right. Oh, I'm right. My thinking is sound, and I'll prove the world's round. It won't take very long. Then Queen Isabella of Spain agreed to supply the ships and men for his trip.
I will discover a shortcut to India and bring back some of the great wealth I find there. And I can do it, for I know the world is round. And instead of going east to India, I shall sail west and reach India around the other way. It will be a shorter and cheaper way, for I'll do it all by...
Then that's high art, of course, by 1960s standards.
That's hideous.
It's hideous. It's bad, ripped-off music, and also the costumes are terribly wrong. You may notice that the experts in there are wearing ruffled collars from the 17th century and hats and so on. But it's
balderdash.
It was something. This was shown in schools. This is something that we told our young people. And as I say, and Ted Cruz was repeating, even though Galileo is out of the picture, Ted Cruz was repeating the myth that scientists and educated people once thought the world was flat. Now they think the climate is changing. They were wrong then, they can be wrong now.
Right.
But one of the things that we have seen, and we're going to get to in more detail, educated people since at least the time of Homer, or at the very least since since about 500 years BC or BCE, depending on your preference, have known that the world was spherical. So the idea of drawing upon this mythical lost knowledge and saying we could be just as wrong today, it doesn't hold water.
Not at all.
And it's potentially dangerous because you are making these assumptions and saying they were stupid then, we're smart now. I want to show another clip, mainly because I love it.
From Saul Bass.
Yes. This is a. Let's switch our audio here.
This was a cartoon that was made in the mid-60s.
What is the shape? Made as part of a promotional piece for Alcoa Aluminum Corporation.
Right, and it's called "Why." The edifice from the cartoon "Why Man Creates." And if you ever look it up on YouTube,
which it's available free,
definitely look for it because the entire cartoon is fascinating.
Oh yes, it's actually part of a longer piece.
Yeah,
we're just take a quick look here.
We're just going to play a little bit of it.
Is the shape of the earth flat? What happens when you get to the edge? You fall off. Does the earth move? Never.
The earth moves.
The Earth is round.
The blood circulates. There are worlds smaller than ours. There are worlds larger than ours.
Oh, that was a short cutout. Sorry about that. But clearly, this is part of a brilliant cartoon. It's talking about the progress of ideas, the progress of new ideas which change our perspective, which is true. Yes. Paradigm shifts in thinking. But it's also...
But it's still repeating the error that the people in the Middle Ages thought the world was flat and that this Earth did not move.
Right. Well, they did think the Earth didn't move.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into that in a few
all right,
seconds.
and that's actually quite significant. But the point is, the evidence was there, and thinking people are stupid in the past tense, I believe we're going to make a case is dangerous. But let's go back into deep, dark, ancient history and talk about Homer.
Dear old Homer.
Homer, and that is allegedly. Would you like to take this one? You know your Homer better than I do.
Yeah, Homer was probably an amalgam of poets. He was from a tradition in the 9th century BCE of people known as rhapsodes. These were poets who could recite a huge amount of poetry, millions of lines.
Any of them
poetry.
from like Prague area? Those would have been Bohemian rhapsodies.
Yes, that is where we get the term rhapsody from. But the rhapsodes were quite good at not only presenting poetry, but writing it down itself.
But what does Homer have to do with the flat Earth?
So Homer, in his Iliad and Odyssey, which is probably one of the more important and well-known epic poems from ancient Greece, deals with an Earth that is kind of like a large island with several oceans in the middle, the Mediterranean Ocean and the Black Sea. And you can see here,
you can see the shape of Italy there in the middle, in Greece.
Egypt, Libya.
I'm not sure when this map is from. I know it's based on Homer, but you'll notice it's labeled in Latin, not in Greek. So
right. But geographers call this kind of map the OT map. O meaning the ocean around the continent, and T as in there's the oceans that go straight across, and then of course Egypt or the Red Sea, the Nile River, the Red Sea is the up and down part of the T.
My question is, should we take Homer's description of a flat Earth or a disc-shaped Earth, which does appear in his text,
right,
as being literal, or was even that figurative? Now this is what about almost 3,000 years ago, I believe.
Well, no. Well, almost 3,000 years ago, but Homer is repeating tales that had been told back in the Bronze Age of Greece. So this was back before the 12th century BCE. So that's a very old tradition.
Oh, by the way,
so
this is a map from 1280. Notice it's a later T&O map.
Yeah.
This is the Harford map from England, which there have been some people who have looked at this and said, see, they believed in a flat Earth. There's other people say, no, it's very hard to draw a sphere.
Yes. It's very hard to represent a sphere on a two-dimensional map.
But what I wanted to jump in here and comment on is Homer, who is used in several places, say, well, at the time of Homer, they believed in a flat disc-shaped Earth. Homer described the wine-dark sea rather famously. Now, I doubt it was wine-colored.
Right.
I think that Homer may, I have no evidence for this, have been having a few poetic liberties.
Silly poets having poetic liberties. Imagine that. But let's talk about what's going to happen after Homer, because Greek scholarship is going to go away from poetry and into what we now think of is mathematics, geometry, and natural philosophy, as they call
logic?
Also science and logic, the pre-Socratic thinkers. So I want to talk a little bit about who in Greek scholarship was writing about the shape of the Earth and what they thought it would be. Now, Pythagoras...
He's one of my favorites. He was a great hero. He was a conqueror. He was a warrior.
No, he wasn't.
Well, what was he?
Anyway, Pythagoras lived in Samos and in southern Italy. He was one of the earliest pre-Socratic thinkers. Now, he is attributed with, of course, the Pythagorean theorem. It's told that he's a great geometer, and he's has a very important mathematical principles. But in reality, there's a lot ascribed to him, but he never left any writings. So it's important to understand none of his writings are extant. If he did write anything down, And the first biographies were written 150 years after his death. To make matters worse, there were later schools of philosophy that considered him a miracle worker, and detractors such as Aristotle, who insisted Pythagoras believed beans were the repository of souls and they should not be eaten.
What happens if you eat them?
Yeah.
Would they cry out in pain?
They would cry out in pain.
That was actually, I'm sorry, you
Yes.
missed a free joke.
I know.
Yes,
I know.
allegedly, the story is told I believe it was from the comic
Right.
playwrights that said, Pythagoras believes that beings are human. Well, maybe
Actually,
they're
no, it's
screaming when they
Aristotle.
fart.
It's Aristotle that said it. It's in one of Aristotle's work.
All right, but did Pythagoras say the world was round?
We don't know,
Then why are we talking about him?
but it is attributed to him that he discovered the sphericity of the earth, the 5 celestial zones, and the identity of the morning and evening star. Modern historians see these as later exaggerations made to bolster the fame of the Neo-Pythagorean school of the later 5th century BCE. So Pythagoras, we don't know what the shape of his cosmos is. What we can credit him today is the sense that he is moving away from lyric poetry and ritual and tradition and moving into more logical
There are
areas.
scholars who say, or there have been allegations that he believed in an spherical earth.
Right.
You talked about it.
Right. So
Okay.
that one is up in the air. Who we have to truly credit is Empedocles.
I did it again. Oh, look at that beautiful feedback.
Feedback.
Oh, notice that's
Where the-
Atlas. Atlas is holding a spherical earth too.
Yes, and
Okay.
that is an ancient Roman statue.
A copy of
Okay.
Greek. Okay, what about
So,
this Empedocles? Great name.
Empedocles lived in Sicily. He was a physician, a philosopher, and a poet.
Why are all these
He-
Greeks Italians?
Yes, he is mentioned by Plato and Aristotle, although we do have some of his writings. He was the last philosopher to write his ideas in verse poetry. So if you read Empedocles, you're reading poetry.
I think the world isn't flat at all. In fact, I think
Because
it's
he
shaped
looks
like a ball.
Yeah. Okay. So if you're dealing with Empedocles, you're dealing with poetry. In his poem on nature, he claims that everything was made of the 4 elements, and this is the ancient Greek 4th elements: earth, air, fire, and water.
And quintessence.
Hang on.
Okay.
And these were moved by 2 separate forces, love and strife.
Oh.
When love is dominant, all the elements are united in a sphere, while strife is trying to pull them apart. This creates a vortex, and the lighter elements get flung to the outer regions, and earth is the heaviest, and so it's the center. And then on top of that is water, the next heaviest, then air, and then fire, which is, of course, symbolized by the sun. So he's seeing a round Earth surrounded by moving stars. It was a geocentric system. But he does answer a few of our the phenomena. One other thing.
Yes.
Phenomena. Anyway, so where did animals come from in Empedocles' cosmos?
I haven't even got a punchline for this. Where did
Okay.
animals come from?
Well, they originally were no complete animals.
What? There's a half animal? Oh, look.
Oh,
Hey, look, it's a horse's ass.
No, it's worse than that. There were legs and hands and arms and heads and torsos and tails and bits of animals running around until they found the other parts that best suited them. It's all part of this love and strife thing.
Wait.
with the
This
4
guy
elements.
was not being poetic? I mean, saying,
We don't know.
I need to find a brain or a heart like
The
Wizard of Oz. I need to find an arm. That works in poetry. I don't know that he really believed there were people like the Black Knight in Monty Python. I'm looking for an arm. Come back and fight. I need an arm.
Yes.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So anyway, but that's Empedocles. So we can credit him with the earliest ideas for certain of around Earth.
What about Aristarchus?
Hang on.
Oh, we're not ready for
We're not there.
Aristarchus?
We're
Oh,
not there yet.
go back. All right.
Oh wait,
sorry.
yes we are. I have everything in the wrong order in my notes.
I would like to emphasize to our viewing audience that this particular technical mistake was hers. The rest of them were mine, but this
Yes.
one was hers.
Okay. Aristarchus of Samos. He is someone that we should pay attention to because
With that
he
beard, how could you
proposed-
not pay attention to him? Wow.
Yeah, that is a hipster beard. Anyway, so he proposed that the hearth of the sky, as he called it, i.e., the sun, should not move, just as the hearth of the house does not move. But the planets moved around it and the earth spun on its axis. He knew that the path of the earth was so large this would create a problem with parallax when viewing the stars. His answer was that the stars were so far away this would not happen.
Wait, but that's pretty significant.
Yes.
Because if I can jump in here, the distances that stars are from us
Right.
is so phenomenal
Right.
that, I mean, just the example
There's no parallax.
well,
Right.
supposedly if the Earth were the size of a tennis ball, the nearest star would be about 35 miles away.
Right.
So, I mean, the
definitely.
distances are unbelievable. The Greeks didn't even have a word for billion.
Right.
And they're a lot more than a billion miles or
So-
feet. So it's,
so
I can't
he's-
imagine that he could fathom
He's definitely
scales.
definitely thinking outside of the box.
or the universe.
We know of his works because other writers such as Archimedes, but only one of Aristarchus's works survived, where he tries to figure out the size and distances of the sun and the moon.
And that's what this graphic
that
is showing.
survived. Ptolemy would use these formula to get a more accurate answer. Ptolemy had a better answer as far as how distant the Earth and the Moon were, and how the Moon and the Sun were from Earth, and how big they actually were. So Aristarchus missed his later moment in the Sun. His name and his ideas of the heliocentric cosmos were mentioned in the earliest manuscripts of Copernicus's work. But when that work was printed in 1453, his name was excised out.
Your date's wrong. It wasn't 1450. I think it was 1553.
1553, sorry.
Okay. His name was
So-
excised out. I wonder why.
Is that?
Okay.
Don't know. Maybe
right.
because he was pagan.
Well, okay.
We don't know. Anyway, so Aristarchus had a spherical Earth and he had a heliocentric system. So yay, Aristarchus.
Okay, I know that heliocentric was never a mainstream position, though.
This is the important thing to understand about the Greeks, is that they separated the two. They argued vociferously for a spherical Earth, but it was up in the air whether it was geocentric or heliocentric.
Actually, I believe it was pretty much taken that it was
It was
geocentric, pretty much common
taken,
knowledge.
It was geocentric.
Now,
Aristarchus
we
was
haven't.
the
We're
author.
still talking about the Greeks. We haven't talked
Right.
about how sailors and the classic story of why do you see the top of a ship
Right.
first,
Right.
which supposedly from a very early time they would have figured out. Which is why I even have questions about
Okay,
Homer.
our next
But
guy.
let's just take a look back at our timeline. So Aristarchus, we're talking about 310 to 230. Okay.
Right.
This is obviously pre-Roman Empire stuff. This is okay.
With Aristotle, because he wrote so much, it's Aristotle's work that gets picked up by everybody during the Roman period, during the very earliest Middle Ages. Aristotle is it. He is called the philosopher. And with his philosophy is some of his empirical work. And with Aristotle, we get the spherical Earth, but a geocentric cosmos.
And Aristotle had the one, which is why geocentric
Right.
was mainstream, is because Aristotle was so widely accepted.
Right. So it is Aristotle who gives us later people the idea of a spherical Earth, and he will be considered the expert.
Okay.
Euclid, of course, and his geometry is going to be passed down.
Wasn't
and
that a
that's-
matter of Euclid was saying spheres are perfect, the universe
Right.
is perfect, therefore
Right.
the universe is a sphere, which, by the way, is not the way to prove anything.
Right. And Aristotle believed that, of course, the circle was the perfect
Within a circle, within a
shape. So he ascribed that to the orbits of the planets and the sun and the moon around the earth and the stars. Of course, mathematically, this doesn't work out very well. But Aristotle is going to pick up on Empedocles' work, and he's going to repeat the ideas of the earth, air, fire, and water, the four elements, although Aristotle's going to add a fifth element, quintessence, which is what the stars move around in. So Aristotle's going to add
luminiferous ether.
luminiferous ether is another way.
Okay. So
going back into the 3rd century BCE, we have everybody's favorite, and of course, I'm talking about Eratosthenes.
I suspect most of our audience knows who Eratosthenes is, but
The
we might refresh it.
librarian of Alexandria. He coined the word geography, and it's considered one of the founders of the discipline. In about 240 BCE, Eratosthenes calculated Earth's size with very, very good accuracy. But his methodology only works on a spherical Earth, according to him.
I would like to mention here that Eratosthenes, there is no reason to believe he was trying to prove the Earth was spherical. That was a known thing. He was trying to calculate the size of the Earth.
Right.
Especially since the size of the known Earth was significantly smaller than the size of the real Earth.
Right. But he gets really, really, really close. We don't know exactly what the size of unit he used to measure.
There's debate
it's
over
called
the size
a stadia.
A stadia, yes.
And we don't know how big a stadia exactly was.
But there's a conventional wisdom that says that he was pretty near spot on. It was
pretty
it
much
works out about
within-
24,000 miles, 25,000 miles.
Yeah, so he's within about 1 to 2% of the actual size.
By digging a hole, or actually looking down a hole in the ground, which goes to show that,
Eratosthenes,
sometimes the truth can be
Right.
found in a hole in the ground.
Right. Eratosthenes also was the first one to theorize that the Earth tilted on its axis, and he figured out what that tilt was. He produced the first map of the world featuring meridian lines and parallel lines. These were similar to our modern lines of latitude and longitude. He marked the equator in its size, considered the size of the polar zones, and how far these zones were from the tropics. So he's got a really well understood Earth under his feet, but he's still a geocentrist. He also invented what's called the armillary sphere, which for 1800 years was the most important device for understanding the cosmos. Imagine a sphere in the center.
Now I have a picture of that,
Which is Earth.
we
Do you
can
have an
show. I do, but
armillary?
it's when we talk about.
But that's okay.
It's when we talk about Roger. My fingers are fat. When we talk about Roger Bacon, which is coming up later, Roger Bacon here is shown.
There you go. He's holding an armillary. He's holding what Eratosthenes invented. And Eratosthenes' armillary had the Earth in the center. It had the zodiac spinning around it, and it had the stars and the planets moving around that. And it was one of the earliest ways of
A model of the known universe.
Of modeling the known universe, but again, geocentric. And then last but not least of the Greeks, and this is a Greek.
Oh, you
who's
told me about
working-
this guy.
Who? Oh.
Sorry. It's easy humor, folks. Okay.
He's one of the latest Greeks. In fact, he's working after Greece had ceased to be its own independent country and had been taken over by the Romans.
Wonder
And
why
that's-
he's wearing 16th century clothing in that picture.
That's a 16th century image of him. Anyway, that's,
Wait. So in the Middle Ages, they revered these characters.
yes.
They didn't forget their wisdom. No, that's a conventional position that we're
yeah.
attacking here. Is that
Right.
that there's a lot of people recite the idea that the Greeks had this all figured out, and then we went into the Dark Ages and we
Right.
forgot everything that they had worked out.
But no,
And
we have keep on that.
Okay.
We have Claudius Ptolemy, who is going to come around in the 2nd century CE, so AD. Ptolemy had a very good sense of mathematics, and in fact, better than people like Aristotle, and almost in the same vein as
that's quite a complex diagram.
Eratosthenes.
There. I look at that.
So he's still working with the geocentric Earth, but he's also dealing with all the data that had been collected for 2,000 years before him, from the Babylonians, from the Greeks, from the Egyptians, et cetera, because he wanted to keep those circular orbits of the planets, the moon, and the stars around the Earth, but he couldn't see how the retrograde motion, which is what we envision from the Earth.
Well, retrograde motion is astrologers today still talk about it. It is an
Right.
observable phenomenon that if I watch, we actually did a video on this for somebody
Yes.
else once. If I'm
Yeah.
watching a star relative or planet relative to another planet, it goes forwards. It seems to go backwards.
Right. And it's because of Earth's orbit working with their orbit. So it becomes this weird little dance that they do every so often. Of course, Ptolemy had enough data so that he could see, oh, okay, this keeps happening. This is not something that just happens. So he has to account for that phenomenon.
Okay, now this is a big deal that he is
Yeah.
using observed phenomenon to adjust his findings rather than starting with a theory like the
Right.
Earth is perfect and
Right.
doing it. He is adjusting his things and coming up with what I think is a very complex diagram, that one on the right there.
It's a little bit crazy. For one thing, he looks at the supposed orbits around the Earth, and he says they're not actually happening around the Earth perfectly. The Earth isn't in the center. The Earth is actually off the center, and all of the orbits are centered on an area between the Earth and the Moon. That accounts for what we now know as elliptical orbits. Now, about the retrograde motion. Ptolemy, if you look at this diagram, we're looking down at the orbits from above. He contended that the planets themselves moved in circles inside their own orbits.
That seems a little inelegant, but it did fit the math.
The math fit very, very well, and everybody knew it. The math fit extremely well. In fact, when Copernicus comes along in the 16th century, or the mid-16th century, his math doesn't work as well. Ptolemy's math works better.
For predicting where a planet will be at
Exactly,
a certain time.
yeah.
Okay, so I think that covers the Greeks and the establishment that there was widespread. So, we didn't give you one, we didn't give you two, we gave you 5 experts who established that the world was spherical in the Greek beliefs. Now, these people influenced thought, teaching, everything else. It was a widespread position. Now we come to the Middle Ages and the question of what happened to this collected wisdom? What happened? But strangely, I'm going to jump to a totally different place and make a passing reference to something I found fascinating, but it's mostly beyond the scope.
Sure.
And that is Aryabhata.
Yay.
Aryabhata lived around 500 CE. He was an Indian mathematician. He is part of a group of items that I'm discovering and reading lately, where there's a couple of Indian historians and historians of science who come up with stuff and say, the Indians did this first. The Indians did that first.
They're making very good cases.
Yeah,
There
some of the stuff
even-
is like, that's extremely plausible, if not
yes.
absolutely true.
Because in the subcontinent of India, they had universities going, and they had real advanced work in mathematics, in chemistry.
And there's some evidence, for example, that the Indians had gunpowder before the Chinese,
Right.
which is quite a shocker.
Quite a feat.
But Aryabhata calculated the value of pi to 3.1415, which is pretty darn good. He believed in a heliocentric solar system. I believe is a strong word. He calculated the idea of a heliocentric solar system. He is the first person in recorded history to create a numerical value of 0 and find that it was useful.
Yes.
So that the Arabic numerals, the Arabic things has an Indian connection.
Right. They come a lot of what we understand about mathematics that the Europeans got from the Arab world, the Arabs got from the Indian world. There was quite a bit of trade going on.
There was trade going on, and there's a lot that we don't fully have established
Right.
yet. But Aryabhata shows, by the way, that spherical Earth, even heliocentric solar system,
Right.
was an idea being discussed around the world in many places.
Did we discuss why they thought the Earth was round?
The Indians?
You see, the Greeks and Aryabhata.
Well, I believe one of the principal things was, of course,
The shadow of the Earth.
the shadow of the Earth.
across
Okay,
moon.
the shadow of the Earth. Yes, during a whole lunar eclipse, you get the
Right.
shadow of the Earth passing across the moon, and it's round.
It's clearly round.
It's clearly round. That's
If it was
established.
flat-
Even if it was a disc, it would be oblate because it's
Yeah.
never not the
Right.
perfect angle.
Actually, I saw one cartoon, and it's the shadow of the Earth on the moon, and it's flat, and then it's elephants all the way down. It's like
Elephants,
elephants.
not turtles, but elephants all the way down.
Anyway,
All right. I do not have a picture of one of the first guys I want to talk about. Shame on me.
oh well,
But we're going to jump straight into
the Middle Ages.
the Middle Ages.
The time that supposedly, according to Saul Bass, according to modern people,
Everyone believed
everyone
the
believed
world was flat. Okay. And we know of two people that argued the world was flat in the entire Middle Ages. Two thinkers, if you're going to call them.
now we
They're
don't
very
know.
early Middle
Okay,
Ages. Early.
we don't know everybody that wrote and thought about the round Earth versus the flat Earth. So have to have that disclaimer in there.
Well, we haven't interviewed every one of them, yes.
Right. And we're also having to privilege, of course, people who could write, which in the early part of the Middle Ages was a really small pool of people. But
Okay. The prominent person who is referenced by many people, well, people start with this guy, which is St. Augustine. St. Augustine was a church follower. Father, I'm going to look up a quote from him. Would you please brief people on who Augustine was?
St. Augustine, he was bishop of Hippo, which I believe was in Thrace. I could be very, very wrong on that. And he was one of the early fathers of the Christian church. He was pre-Roman Catholic, but belonged in the Byzantine tradition of the very early church fathers.
But he really established much of modern Christian.
Right. He wrote an important work known as the City of God and the City of Man, basically where he outlines this is heaven and this is earth.
Okay. Augustine was concerned with the concept of antipodes, which is a phrase I love. Antipodes. I just like the sound of this.
Yep.
Check out the antipodes on that one.
Right.
But antipodes is the idea that where you are living, there's somebody standing opposite you on the earth, upside down from you. And this quote has been used in a number of histories of how the Middle Ages didn't believe this, because the Middle Ages did recite the teachings of Augustine. So here's the quote here. But as the fable that there are antipodes, that is to say, men on the opposite side of the earth, where the sun rises, when it says to us, men who walk with their feet opposite ours, that is on no ground credible. Okay, he did not buy the concept that there were people living upside down from you.
But he had mathematical ideas and traditional ideas from the ancient Greeks about why this occurred.
Okay, let me just point something out here. This is from the City of God, chapter 9. This is quoted in a number of history books we're going to talk about later that talk about why people in the Middle Ages believed that the earth was flat. But here's basically two sentences down in the same text. It is not affirmed that this has been learned by historical knowledge, but by scientific conjecture on the ground that the earth is suspended within a concavity of the sky and has as much room on one side or the other. Hence, they say that part which is beneath us must also be inhabited. But although it be supposed or scientifically demonstrated that the world is of a round and spherical form, it does not follow that the other side of the earth is bare of water, nor even if it be bare, does it immediately follow that it is peopled. So, do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, so basically what Augustine is saying is that only half of the earth is the half that is known, which is dirt.
Which is
the
inhabited.
Other half,
yes.
And which is inhabited. The other half, the half that is night when we are day, basically there's nobody there. We don't have to worry about antipodes.
But the point is that first part of that quote is shown in the books like Washington Irving, which I'm hoping to get to soon, as examples that people did treat Augustine as being holy. Everything he said was wisdom.
Yes.
But he basically acknowledged the earth is spherical.
Right.
In the same paragraph.
So, but it's important to remember their vision of Earth was, of course, a sphere, but there's only land on 180 degrees. The other 180 degrees, water.
Okay.
No, uninhabited, nobody's there. So
well, that makes sense. They knew about China. There had been people who had gone,
Right.
and they say, there's an ocean there, seems uncrossable. There's an ocean there, seems uncrossable. It follows that it's ocean all the way around.
Yes.
And remember, they knew the size of the earth.
Exactly. They knew the size of the Earth. And remember those O and T maps. Those could conceivably cover 180 degrees of the sphere with that ocean on the outside.
Now, there is a theological point that comes in here,
Right.
which is that, and they referred to, the Bible says, go out and preach the world. All this basically says
Right.
that the sons of Noah populated the entire earth. And if, according to this teaching, you can't sail across it, then there's another reason there's no land there, because the Bible says they were taught. And since they couldn't get there, there couldn't be people there. So
Right.
that is biblical literalism. That is the real thing there.
Right.
But it's not being used to argue a flat earth. It's being used to argue the rest of the earth isn't populated.
Right.
Okay. Very influential thinker. Most of the work we're going to look at here, though, focuses on two other teachers who are less known. There's a good chance that most of our audience has never even heard of. Let's start with this guy, Lactantius. Lactantius. Ooh, sounds like, I don't know, Lactantius sounds like that.
Who knows?
No, I don't know. It sounds dirty, whatever it is. Lactantius was the first Christian apologist. He had been a pagan.
Right.
He was an advisor to the Emperor Diocletian, I believe, who was the massive persecutions.
He was an advisor to Diocletian, who was the emperor who really persecuted the Christians, but he is also the emperor that broke the empire into 4 separate pieces, the Tetrarchy.
Okay, one of those was taken over by Constantine, who
Right.
embraced Christianity, and he...
No, only after he took over the empire.
All right.
Right.
Lactantius converted to Christianity actually earlier than Constantine.
See, also, he was an opportunist.
I don't know that. I've never met him. It might have
Anyway.
been sincere. It's really,
Sure.
it's really not fair to say he was an opportunist. But Lactantius became the tutor to Constantine's son,
Ah, okay.
which Constantine
one-
later murdered. But that's
the guy
that's
that
how.
Constantine murdered. Okay.
Okay, Constantine wasn't all nice, by the way, but actually had him executed. He didn't murder him. Nonetheless,
Didn't want to get his hands.
Lactantius was the first Christian apologist, and he spent a lot of time arguing for the literal truth of the Bible as interpreted at a time when much of the population of the Roman Empire was still worshiping Mars.
Right.
So it's a big task. He wrote volumes of work, and
That was still around.
it's still around. And this picture that I was showing you, this image on the right, that is a copy of the text that was printed in 1420. So it would have been available to Columbus. So Lactantius was a true biblical literalist. He argued at one point for a flat earth with the logic that the pagans believe the earth is round.
Yes.
That makes
So
it
he-
flat.
Yes. He basically is counter-programming the pagans by saying, oh, if they think it's round, then we've got to think it's flat. So he is going to be one of the earliest champions of the flat earth.
How is it that those who imagine there are antipodes opposite our footsteps, do they say anything to that purpose? Or is there anyone so senseless as to believe that these men whose footsteps are higher than their heads, or that things which are in a recumbent position with them hanging in the inverted direction? Anyway, that it rains. They thought the world, they, referring to the pagans, the others, thought the world round like a ball, and they fancied that the heaven revolves in accordance with the motion of heavenly bodies. And thus, that the stars in heaven, when set very rapidly in motion, they both constructed brazen orbs as though the figure of the earth engraved upon them contained monstrous images, which they said were constellations.
Oh, he's talking about the armillary.
Yes, okay. It followed, therefore, from this rotundity of heaven that the earth was enclosed in the midst of a curved surface. But if this were so, the earth itself must be like a globe, for that could not possibly be anything but round, which was held enclosed by that which was round. But if the earth were round, it must necessarily happen that it must present the same appearance to all parts of heaven, that it should raise a lot, anyway, blah, 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 blah. The rotundity of earth leads in addition to the invention of those suspended antipodes. So Lactantius did argue for a flat earth,
Yes.
and he did have some impact on
Yes.
medieval thoughts,
Yes.
but
Clearly not as big as everyone else, because Aristotle's going to hold sway.
Aristotle, especially by the time of the
Thomas
Scholastic
Aquinas.
Revolution, which starts in around the 12th century and continues for a
Right.
while. By that time, Aristotle was embraced and Lactantius was pretty marginalized.
There was another guy.
There's another guy. Go ahead.
What his name was Cosmus
Can she say this? This is a tough name. Can you say it?
Indicopleustes.
Indicopleustes.
Well, there's a U in there.
I know.
Anyway. Indicopleustes.
Indicopleustes, which they don't actually even know this gentleman's name. He was Greek. Indicopleustes basically means that guy who sailed to India. Cosmas was kind of just a forename given. Indicopleustes traveled. He was not as good a writer as Lactantius.
Yeah.
So, folks, if you want to be a successful writer, just try going back in time and writing a travelogue.
Right.
Inventing a time machine going back in time is still easier than getting attention from some publishers.
Definitely.
No, I'm not bitter.
Definitely.
What are you talking? No,
You're
bitter, no,
You're bitter.
jealous.
Anyway, but as the modern historian Russell says, who found this guy's work, there were only 4 copies of his book available. So he was not well known. But
Curiously, we do have copies today.
Right. But he was not advocating for round Earth. He was definitely advocating for flat Earth.
Yes. This is his map of the Earth. This is a classic T&O map. I can't quite make any sense out of it, but this is his map. This is his diagram of the universe. Now, yes, it's a treasure chest. Lactantius base, and you can see you've got kind of a T&O there, and you got a giant mountain in the middle, and you got the face of God up above. His idea was that it was modeled, or basically it is the Ark of the Covenant as described in the book of Exodus in the Bible. Basically everything reflects everything else. And so heaven is this curved lid, box with a lid on top of it, and the sphere edges on it. Anyway, you can see this giant moon, that is the Earth down below, and the sun is that circle in the sky. Here's a closer image. The argument that he made was it gets dark at night when the sun passes behind this mountain, and you get a big shadow falling across the Earth.
So night occurs because the sun goes behind the great mountain at the top of, or the middle of the Earth. Okay, fine.
I have one more image of his that I did not
you
upload. Yeah, well, actually, this is also just to let you know how sincere Lactantius was and how he figured things out. I'm going to show you another image from his diagram, from his travelogue. And again, it's horrible writing. It's just wretched stuff. But he basically called it Christian typography. Is that what he said?
Topography.
Topography, yes.
Topography.
And he wrote this book, which is still available. You can find it online at Internet Archive. But he also talked about the animals that he encountered in his travels.
Ah.
So
Don't shoot him. There's only one.
Okay, now scholars of the history of Columbus and what we're calling the Columbus myth really got into exercising these people, these idea. And there's Washington Irving talks about Cosmas and how much influence he had, even though there's no evidence of influence at the time. Again, we have a copy of Lactantius from the 15th century. We don't have copies of Cosmas from that time. But I wanted to get into the real medieval thinkers because, contrary to popular opinion, people in the Middle Ages were not all stupid.
Right.
You didn't exactly see them voting for Brexit.
Well, but you definitely had them starting universities. And of course,
I'm going to start earlier than that. I'm going to start with a gentleman in England who was not very long after Cosmas.
Right.
He was called the Venerable
Bead. Yes.
I think it's pronounced Bead, but I like to say Beady because it sounds funnier.
The Venerable Bead.
This is a 15th century drawing of him. But the Venerable of Bead, you can see his quote there, "The roundness of the earth, for not without reason is it called the orb of the world. On the pages of Holy Scripture and ordinary literature is in fact set like a sphere in the middle of the whole universe." This is, as you can see, around 700.
Right.
This is pre-Charlemagne. Bede had a huge influence, and you will find copies of his work, references to him throughout medieval literature, a lot more than you will of Cosmas. We're going to jump forward. Now, again, there's references everywhere, but this is Roger Bacon. We didn't cover his quote here. This is from Opus Majus, Optical Science. On a very high mountain, you can see the height, which is 8 miles. Now, there's no mountains on Earth that are 8 miles high. See that the plane of the Earth's surface only about 250 miles, and the gibbosity of the Earth restricting vision causes this.
So
Gibbosity.
Another word for roundness. So definitely Bacon, probably the great scientist or natural philosopher of his era.
Roger Bacon is a guy that I'm fascinated by, and you can find his work.
amazing.
He was writing a book on optics. So he doesn't go into arguments for or against the flat Earth because he thought that was stupid. He was arguing about the eye, which he was trying to study.
Right.
And he basically said, well, it's like the Earth. And so that, I mean, and there's pages and pages I've read through on this, and it's
Right.
like I was trying to find something pithy enough to put it
Right.
there. But he basically says the eye behaves this way because, like the earth, it is this way, and part of it is in shadow, and part of it is not. And this actually is. Roger Bacon, of course, used his study of optics to invent.
Eyeglasses.
Yeah.
Yep.
Roger.
So
Bacon.
practical application of his work.
Extremely influential philosopher. Then we're going to get to probably the most influential philosopher of the Middle Ages,
Thomas Aquinas.
Uncle Thomas. I'm sorry. Now here's a quote. The astronomer and the physicist both may prove the same conclusion that the Earth is round, the astronomer by means of mathematics and the physicist by means of matter itself. Okay, I've left the rest of the quote in there just for context so you understand. He's, again, not really talking about whether or not the Earth is round. He's talking about the fact that this is an example of two different ways of thinking about a problem.
Right.
Aquinas was very into how we know what we know, thinking about thinking.
Epistemology. Aquinas was, yes, epistemology. Aquinas was a scholastic, meaning in that earliest sense of the word that he learned his philosophy and his logic and his rhetoric from, of course, the ancient Greeks and Romans. That's the text that they used. But he had to marry that with his Christian theology because he was an expert in both. So scholasticism worked very, very hard to make them work together, which is why in Thomas Aquinas's work, we see a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of science all mixed in. And when he gets to the part where he really can't make it work, he just says, oh, mystery. Okay, it's a mystery.
Okay, I'm fascinated by the development of scientific thought in this pre-scientific era. Now, by the way, just to be clear, of course, that text was written in Latin. The word for astronomer is astrologos.
Right,
but I
astrologer.
don't know that that means astrologer in the sense that we mean it.
I disagree with that translation because I think calling it a physicist and an astronomer.
The word for physicist is naturist.
It's not
in the original text.
I think the translator is trying to make it approachable for us now, but I don't think it conveys some of the same ideas that Thomas Aquinas would have been acquainted with. The orb, one of the other ways we know that the medieval people understood the cosmos as an orb, if you go to look at the various images of kings and a few queens.
You could have told me I would have pulled this up.
I wish I had. I did. I sent you some, but you forgot to put it in. They're all holding the orb and scepter. The scepter, the symbol of correction, the symbol of law, and the orb, and it's usually got a cross on the top of it. No, it's not the holy hand grenade of Antioch. This is the Orbis Mundi, the orb of the world, with the cross on top, symbolic of Jesus Christ having his influence over the entire world. And of course, you've got the king holding that, meaning that the king has earthly possession of this Orbis Mundi. There's a couple of images, however, that I wish I had made sure you put it in, because there's one of Elizabeth I. She's not holding the orb like you would hold an apple or an orange, like all the other kings. It's on her lap, and she's got her hand on it. See also, as a queen, she cannot be holding the earth. She has to be merely in contact. Anyway.
Okay, so I think we've kind of established
to the
for
patriarchy.
you. And
Anyway.
I think we've kind of established that there was a lot of medieval thought that said the world was spherical. Certainly the educated people, mostly highly. So you may be asking, okay, how does Columbus fit into this? Who do we know? Whom do we know that Columbus was literally acquainted with? Because he was a relatively uneducated, formally educated. I mean, he traveled, he lived in Italy, Portugal, Spain, briefly England, France, and so on. But we're getting now to an interesting character who is much less famous, who had perhaps more influence on Columbus. That is this guy.
Pierre Diene.
Pierre Diene was, as you can see, 1351 to 1420. So he had died, 70 years before Columbus sailed across the ocean.
He was a bishop and very well educated.
Cardinal, actually.
Cardinal.
Very well educated. He was involved he was central to ending what's called the Great Western Schism, which you have a short video on. Yeah. I would love to do a longer discussion on, which is basically the Catholic Church split up in the 14th century and had three popes. I'm the pope. No, I'm the pope. Pierre Diene got them all together and said, you guys are all out of here.
Yeah.
And we're picking a new pope. And this is after two other attempts to do this had failed. He actually got them to agree, and he's the reason that there's one pope today. We also made a film about one of the dissenters at that time was a man named Jan Hus, who Pierre Diene had burned at the stake. But that's way beyond the scope of this, but it is something that we had studied.
Anyway, back to Pierre Diene.
He wrote a book called Imago Mundi.
Or the image of the world.
And if you can see on the right, that is a page from it. And that is how he maps. Mapping was different to Diene for some reason. So if I could zoom in on that, and I might just a little bit, you can see that he's describing locations. Like here it says Africa, Asia, with Europe. Words rather than drawing the shape in any kind of detail.
This is a concept that would carry over into maps of the time called Portalia, which is
Gateway?
that's a list of the ports.
Okay, but you can see he wasn't really interested in drawing pictures. He's just showing approximate relationship. And you also notice that the bottom half of the Earth is completely unpopulated, which seems to be a great mythos. Now, for the record, if I was in Columbus's time, I would be worried about maybe not sailing off the end of the Earth, but sailing to where the ocean goes on forever,
right? Which
would probably be just as scary as sailing off the edge of the Earth, except you die more slowly.
Anyway, so Pierre Diene's work on understanding his Imago Mundi was that the Earth was considerably smaller than what Eratosthenes said.
He calculated this, I'm not entirely sure how, but he basically said that the continent of Asia, this is the map that as he saw it. I don't know that he drew this because I have seen no other pictures in his work, although this was in an edition of the work.
Sure.
This is his map of the world. You can basically see it's land all the way to land and just a little bit of ocean on the east and west edge.
But he contended that the landmass of Europe and Asia and Africa did not cover 180 degrees of this globe, but in fact covered 220 degrees of this globe, making the ocean much smaller.
Okay, which
in some ways he kind of had a point because he's playing with the latitudes a little bit.
All right, but he was wrong. He had some other logic, I believe, in astrology that basically led him to write a book called Imago Mundi, which suggested the world was much smaller.
Right.
And there was a person who we know carried a copy of this book with him wherever he went. This guy. Columbus read the work of Diene. He embraced it. He carried it with him. He argued that the Earth was smaller than it is. I love this painting. I love Queen Isabella doing the face palm.
Yeah. So, it was not true that Columbus was setting out to prove the Earth was round. People at the time knew it was round. They also knew how big it was, thanks to Eratosthenes' work. They also knew what the distance was between Lisbon, Portugal, on the very westernmost part of the European continent, and how far away China was. The Silk Road had gone between them. They knew that distance.
Now, in Columbus's writings, and by the way, as I said, he wasn't formally educated. He read a lot. We have a copy of the Journals of Marco Polo, which Columbus had written notes in, and that's in a museum now. And Columbus said, okay, so if China is this far from Portugal, and we know that Japan is 300 miles off the coast of China, then it's much closer.
Right.
Of course, Japan's nowhere near 300 miles off the coast of China, but...
Yes. So he starts adding a little bit more land. There's Japan, and of course there's the Spice Islands, some of which are, of course, east of Japan. So there's islands there. And then he says, go to Portugal, you go west of Portugal, and you hit the Azores and you hit the Canary Islands. These he adds more space to as well. So instead of 220 degrees, he's got the Earth down to something really, really small.
Now, Columbus is living in Portugal when he
Right.
argues this. He's
Right.
married to a Portuguese woman whose father was very influential, and he gets an audience with the King of Portugal.
And the King of Portugal says, yeah,
Excuse me.
you got to be kidding.
You're out of your freaking mind, Chris. It's much farther than that.
Hit the road, kiddo.
There's another part of this story which I think is significant, which is that Portugal at this time was already exploring Africa and Southern Africa.
Portuguese had already been down the west coast of Africa, down to the Cape of Good Hope, and back up the east coast of Africa to...
They hadn't been up the East Coast yet. Sorry.
Well, they were heading that way.
Not at the time of Columbus. They were down to Guinea. Columbus actually went down there at one point. So Portugal has this right now. Just to clarify, this is 1490s. In 1454, the city of Constantinople
1453.
falls to the Ottoman Turks. So the land route to trade goods with China, which had existed through much of the Middle Ages, that was closed. So this is why they were looking for a sea route.
Right.
You know, it wasn't just, it's shorter.
Well,
it's
it
like,
wasn't-
no, we can get there without having to deal with these Muslims who are really mad at us right now.
It wasn't going to be that the Ottomans said there will be no trading. The Ottomans said, for a price, Ugati, for a price. And so, you know, the hauling charges, the carrying charges were getting greater and greater and greater for goods from China, especially spices and silk, and something that the governments needed very, very badly.
Porcelain?
Saltpeter.
Oh, okay.
Gunpowder.
That gets into another topic.
Yes.
We mentioned briefly in our show on the Reconquista.
Right.
Isabella's claim to the throne wasn't the best.
Right.
And part of her deal in getting the throne was she promised the king
of Spain.
Isabella's claim was the daughter of the king of Portugal had a better claim. Isabella, in part of her negotiations to say, don't let me have this throne, said, I promise that Spain will not sail south of the Azores.
Right.
So they needed a route to China if they could possibly find one. Whereas the Portuguese were getting very close to getting around. And of course, they did eventually make it around, and they were able to sail around Africa to get there.
Right.
That wasn't open to Spain. Turned out to be a very good guess. But anyway, we're getting into detail. But
so here comes Columbus. He's got this plan. He's got it all laid out, and he thinks it's islands all the way across. The Azores or the Canaries were just another island hopping, and that they could get ships with enough food in them and enough fresh water, and they could easily make it to China, or at least Japan or the Spice Islands, Malacca.
This is a painting, by the way, by a man named Emanuel Gottlieb Leutze, painted in 1843. Leutze was most famous for his painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which makes me think accuracy wasn't the strongest thing. By the way, notice the Moorish architecture inside the palace, which is pretty good.
I love it.
Okay, so we've got Columbus. Basically, they know the world is round. They think that it's farther to get to Asia than he does. Part of his contract says he gets to be Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Lord Protector of any lands discovered.
Right.
Which makes you wonder if he knew more was out there.
There are hints that the English sailors at the time knew something about the cod fisheries off the Great Banks of what we now know as Canada. And of course, the Vikings had been over to Greenland.
Was that known? I don't know if it was known or not.
I don't know.
That's beyond the scope of this presentation. Tune in later for more information. So Columbus, okay, we know this. His math was bad, but literally the rest was history.
So, but he was just darn lucky that there was a continent in between him and Japan.
Okay, so we get two versions of this one myth now circulating. One is that before Columbus, everybody thought the earth was flat. Number two is that the Greeks had figured out the shape of the earth, but the church rejected the information as heretical. Now, this is a big deal. This is where I'm going to offend some of our stronger atheist people, because there was a character assassination attempt on the Christian belief saying they were flat earthers, and it took somebody to prove them wrong.
Right. But as we've shown, the idea that in the Middle Ages the church said that the earth was flat Not true.
Okay, so there were radical ideas going around. Actually, I should explain. Sorry, come back. We're going to jump forward now. We're going to jump forward to the 19th century. So we were just in the 15th century, early 16th century. We're jumping forward to the 19th century because that's when we first start to hear the story that people in Columbus's time thought the world was flat.
But now now with Columbus, the age of discovery, the Renaissance, we've figured this out.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on and led to the spread of this myth, because this is, I think, significant because we believe something. I was taught something. I watched that bad cartoon, probably. I don't remember, but I probably did. I was certainly told by my teachers that Columbus's day, everybody thought the world was flat. Okay, so here are some things that were happening in the 19th century. There was this ancient good, medieval bad, modern good philosophy, which we talked about in our show on the Dark Ages.
The championing of science over religion.
The Middle Ages, the Renaissance, which is a greatly overused term, that we suddenly figured everything out because they were so stupid.
Right.
The Second Great Awakening, which was a religious movement which was centered in the United States, but also existed in Europe as well, which was the birth of modern forms of biblical literalism. Now, I'm going to offend some people with that, but certain things were not taken as literally in documents I can find. Other things were. Plenty of people believed Noah was real, but some of the finely tuned definitions, actually I should mention this because it's remiss to leave it out. Some of the concepts of the end times that we hear in Christian presentations and the end of days and the 1,000-year reign of Christ and so on, that actually comes from Lactantius. He was the one who read through Revelation and said, this means that this will be the 1,000-year reign. Now, the Bible talks about 1,000-year reign, but how you interpret it as being the literal Jesus is ruling and the evil are temporarily resurrected and so on, that's Lactantius, who actually brought that to us in that form. Now, for the biblical literalists, I'm not saying that's not correct. I'm saying that interpretation was first presented by Lactantius. But back then in this 19th century, we've got this movement. We've got Darwin, and I'm going to get to that in more detail in a moment.
Right.
But you've got suddenly religion is being challenged, and people who defend religion are being called flat earthers. It starts to be used as something of a pejorative, although the term flat earther was not in use until 1940. According to Google Ngrams, which is a pretty cool way to think. We had anti-Catholicism.
In America, anti-Catholicism was extremely strong with the Know-Nothings, and then later after the Civil War, the movement against Catholicism was extremely
Samuel Morse
strong.
and so on. Yes.
Right. And it was tied into anti-immigration from places
and
like
anti-slavery.
Right.
This is, by the way, I want to do a show on this sometime too. But the fact is that most of the great heroes of the abolition movement were also saying end slavery and get rid of Catholics.
Yeah.
We don't tell the whole story because it's kind of unpleasant.
Yeah, but it was tied a lot in with immigration of undesirable people like
brown people.
My great grandparents,
okay.
Italians. So definitely, that was part and parcel of this flat Earth myth.
We had the growth, reason over religion, particularly the writings of people like John Locke and the French Revolution. Right. Now, again, this is we're running stuff together here. But since reason over religion really happened before the Second Great Awakening and religion made a comeback, and the Romantic era, and this is something that I think is crucial because you've got the cult of the hero.
Right.
And what's your term for it?
My term for it, and I coined it for this show, I doubt if it will catch on, is the concept of the maverick savant. The person who considers themselves as capable of overturning scientific consensus. And they look to this cult of heroes, people like, Edison, Thomas Edison.
Uneducated.
Or people like the Wright brothers.
Uneducated.
Supposedly, that they, through pluck and luck and their
and believing what they believed, even when everybody told them was wrong.
Right.
When all those guys with the bad singing said, the world is flat, you're mad. But he believed and he won out and he was right. We love that story.
Yeah.
These are the champions.
Yeah, we love the story of the bicycle mechanics that were able to figure out how to fly when the greatest minds of the world could not figure out. In truth is, they had gotten books like this one, Progress in Flying Machines by Octave Chanute.
Now, Chanute was a technical advisor to the Wright brothers. They had a whole bunch.
Right.
And this is way, way off topic,
Yeah,
folks.
this is way off topic, but my point is that the idea of this romantic cult of the hero and the maverick savant is something that became very important in the Romantic era. Even looking at Columbus as this hero, this
You know who
maverick
helped make
savant?
Columbus a hero? Really created the mythos of the modern Columba as
The
this
Italians.
brave man. The Italians did embrace him, and you know
Right.
that Columbus Day was an Italian holiday, Italian-American holiday. But the modern myth of Columbus, in many ways, comes from this guy.
Ah.
Washington Irving, yes, the man who wrote Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Washington, what?
I forgot. Happy Pumpkins. That's a joke. Anyway,
Happy Pumpkins?
yes.
Because of Sleepy Hollow. I heard, I'm not saying Washington Irving was sexually attracted to pumpkins, but we really don't know.
We really don't know.
Okay. Washington Irving had been a failed novelist. He tried to make it as a writer for many years, wrote stories. They didn't go anywhere. His first big hit was The Tales of the Voyage of Columbus,
Right.
1828. And he created this story that we saw. Now, that painting I showed you earlier from 1843, was it? Yes,
Yeah.
1843, largely inspired by this.
By Washington Irving.
Washington Irving.
Washington Irving had been the ambassador to Spain under the Andrew Jackson administration. And he spent quite a few years there traveling, and he got into archives and collections of work that most American scholars had never gotten into.
And I have looked through, I've read portions of his book, Voyages and Discoveries of Columbus in 1828. He also had documents from, Columbus's voyages are really well documented. The most known book is written by a man named Ferdinand Columbus.
The son?
Yes.
Yeah.
Things my daddy did.
Things my daddy did.
Ferdinand Columbus became very wealthy off of the exploits and the development and so on. He established a library, which at one point was the largest library in Spain. It includes a lot of documents on this stuff. It is in Seville. You should go visit it. It is apparently spectacular.
Okay.
The Ferdinand Columbus Library.
Let's go.
Okay. So Washington Irving had access to these. His book reads as if it is scholarly, at least by the standards of 1828. There's footnotes. There's references. The thing is, when you look up those footnotes, it doesn't say what he says it says.
No. I think he was rather secure in the idea that who's going to look it up?
It's a fun book, by the way. Again, I haven't read the whole thing. I've read portions of it. It is an exciting read. It reads like fact. It really feels like, and then this happened. And he even, what I call the Uri Geller trick. Uri Geller would do a magic trick, but it would fail 3 times. He'd say, it's not right. And people would believe him because no real magician would lose on purpose, would fail on purpose. So he has sections in this book where he says, we don't really know what happened here. Some of it is documented, some of it is real. He involves sections of what's called the Conference at Salamanca, where Columbus did go to the University of Salamanca to discuss the proposal. The Queen did send him there. And the scholars at Salamanca said, you're crazy, it's too far. You'll never make it. I don't know why they're speaking like New York Jews.
Here's the facts. Here's what we know. It's way too far. Get out of here, Christopher Columbus.
Yes.
But Washington Irving recreates this scene to be something very different.
And he's got discussions and quotes, seemingly sourced, of people quoting, guess who? Lactantius and Cosmas. Cosmas, who was clearly unknown in the time of Columbus. But there are discussions of this, and also quoting Augustine out of context. Because Augustine, again, argued that there's no antipodes, people can't live upside down. That doesn't mean that he thought the world was flat.
And this is a problem in historical methodology. And that is primary sources, the gold standard for doing history, but singular primary sources, very dangerous. It takes a large amount of primary sources read correctly, or at least, with an eye towards context, not just finding what you wanted to say and sticking it there.
Which
cherry picking.
Well, cherry picking is very easy. So if you're sitting here writing a book, if your preconceived opinion is that everybody in Columbus's time thought the world was fact, you dig through, was flat.
Look, I found 3 people who said the world was flat.
Cosmas, Lactantius, and Augustine taken out of context.
Bingo. It's like an undergrad essay.
Okay, Washington Irving's book had a huge impact. He became very successful. He became very wealthy, and as I say, it's actually kind of a fun read.
Oh yeah,
but
he's a good little writer.
But this is, also I don't really believe everything in Rip Van Winkle either.
No.
Okay.
And Sleepy Hollow reads a little bit strange, except for that sexual part about the pumpkins. But we don't know.
If you don't know what she's talking about, you're better off.
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of an inside joke. Okay. Now, so Washington Irving's book becomes widespread. The myth gets repeated, but it's actually only about 4 pages out of a 500-page book where he discusses this conference. And even there, in Washington Irving's book, there are people arguing this, but most of the people are saying it's too far. You'll run out of food.
Right.
The majority of that. So it's not that strong a case. Even in the book, it's there, but it's basically one of many arguments he has to get onto.
Right.
The story gets more interesting, and how we came to believe this with, of all people, a gentleman by the name of Andrew Dixon White, who founded Cornell University to be an asylum for science.
I love that term.
Cornell University is today, of course, a very modern university which has religious centers for a whole group of different positions and opinions, and welcomes different religious groups, and they get along very nicely. Thank you very much. But he argued that religion had been at war with science and created something called the conflict thesis, which basically says the relationship between religions and science inevitably leads to hostility. There are people today who will believe this. There are people, there are scholars today who will say, not necessarily, because not all religion is Ken Ham.
Right.
Now, Ken Ham has a conflict with science. You can't really accept Ken Ham's version and accept all science. And if you want to believe that God works miracles, then you don't need science. So we don't even need to explain that. But anyway, the point is that for most of the time, the religion was the source of scientific learning. These monasteries were doing real research. And this is
in the Middle Ages.
In the Middle Ages. Obviously Catholic schools don't do scientific research today.
Yeah, they do.
I guess they do.
Yeah.
They do. The Vatican Observatory does major science. So I think, this is my opinion.
Well, remember, Copernicus was working for the Catholic Church.
Yeah, Copernicus is a complex story. I think he was even a priest at one point, but he was...
No, I don't believe he was ordained.
That's right. He wasn't ordained and he never married, but he did have affairs. Anyway, you can find cool stuff if you dig deep enough in history. And all of it is as well-sourced as Washington Irving. Okay, so the conflict thesis, which really grew into popularity in the 1860s, 1870s, just became a widespread thing. White was pushing for it very hard because basically we're going to get religion out of our schools. Now, personally, I think you can coexist with something called respect, but that's beyond it. Dixon White had an acquaintance who was an Englishman and he was an American. Actually, White was actually an immigrant from England. John William Draper.
Okay.
Well, John William Draper wrote a book called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And as you can see in my fine print there, religion usually meant Catholic within this work. And he went into tremendous detail on Lactantius and Cosmas and how these guys were wrong and they were holding back science.
Right.
And this is at a time when you've got evolution and you've got the Second Great Awakening fighting with each other.
Right. And you've got anti-Catholicism that's happening, et cetera, et cetera.
But Draper was very much on the side of evolution. Evolution should be taught. Evolution should be taken seriously. And he's saying if you oppose it, you believe in a flat earth. You're part of this whole thing. It became a pejorative. And I kind of think some of the Christians got a little bit slammed in this discussion.
Right.
Draper was perhaps most famous in his time because there was something called the Oxford debate. Today it's sometimes called the Wilberforce-Huxley debate. Have you heard of it?
Yeah.
Okay. Basically, 6 months after Darwin published The Origin of Species. The Origin of Theseus, he was in the Greek mythology too. Give me a break. We've been talking for a while because we had 3 false starts on this show. Maybe it was 5. Anyway, this debate at Oxford on basically should evolution be taught is remembered today as the Wilberforce-Huxley debate, but it opened and was basically led by a paper that was presented by Draper, a long, lengthy paper on why we should study evolution, we should accept natural selection, and why, if you don't, you're a flat earther.
Right.
The debate is today quite legendary. And it included the classic quote of Huxley said to Wilberforce, and this is Samuel Wilberforce, the son of the man who ended slavery. Huxley said, Wilberforce said, "Would you be ashamed to have a monkey for an ancestor?" To which Huxley said, "I would not be ashamed to have a monkey for an ancestor, but I would certainly be ashamed to be connected with a man who used his gifts to obscure the truth." Ooh. That's seen as one of the great snaps in science education.
Snap.
But the issue here is, obviously natural selection has led to the development of medicines. There's a lot there. Right. If you don't accept it, that's your business. But the point is, using Columbus, and this is part of where this modern mythos comes from, is using a misinterpretation of history. Again, Draper was a medical doctor.
Wasn't a historian.
But he wrote a book on history, and I've read through portions of it. We didn't have time. We only have a little time to prepare the show. And he's going into great details of history, and here's what happened, and here's what happened. So you've got, well, you're a professional historian. What's wrong with me writing a book on history? Everybody else does it.
Yeah. And the thing is, I got trained in all sorts of methodology. And there's such a thing as being very careful about sourcing your materials, etc.
Sourcing isn't enough.
And it seems simple.
Remember, you can have a source. He had Cosmas, who we know was very little read, but he didn't mention Bead. He didn't mention all of these other things. He writes a work of history. And, okay, the most popular science history show in recent years is Cosmos, not to be confused with Cosmos. Cosmos, presented by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is not a historian, but it's a history show. If you watch it, it's history. For the record, what I've seen at the history is pretty good, except he's calling Giordano Bruno more scientific than he really was.
Right, yeah.
But beyond that, the point is you're still getting history from people who are physicists, who are medical doctors, who are other things, and they're not trained in how to weed out selective information, prejudices, biased observers, and all of these other items that influence.
And believe me, if you're not going to be busy as a historian weeding these things out, there are plenty of other historians out there with very long memories and very long knives who are going to cut your stuff to ribbons. And so, we're careful of each other. It's peer review.
Well, you were humiliated for presenting something.
Oh, yes, I was.
I don't know if yes. Do you want to share that story? Or?
No, I don't want to share that story.
She gave a presentation at a panel when you were just a master's student at the time.
I hadn't even got my master's degree. And I made a supposition at the end. I was feeling all full of myself. And I said, hey, I'm going to suppose this. And I got caught and called out, and it was embarrassing as hell. Okay,
but you've got people like Bill O'Reilly writing books of history, and they're bestsellers.
Yeah.
But Bill O'Reilly is not a historian.
And
I haven't read them, so I can't really comment. I'm going to be, because we're talking about being careful in your facts, I'm not going to say they're bad history because I haven't read them. So we get into this mythos of the maverick savant, and I'm going to I said we were going to talk much about the modern flat earth wackos. We're going to cover them in passing because some of them see themselves as maverick savants. I figured out what you couldn't.
Right.
Just like Columbus. I defied the odds and I figured it out all by myself.
And a lot of this comes from, of course, Thomas Kuhn's Scientific Revolutions.
Here's the Structure of Scientific Revolution.
The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Do you have that?
It's probably on the shelf back here.
Yeah. No, I put it back on the shelf. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Thomas Kuhn is a historian of science. He wrote a fascinating book in which he basically says the science goes along on a paradigm. And he's kind of like the first guy to use that term. But as we gather more data, because we're constantly gathering more data for science, you start seeing outliers, stuff that doesn't fit in the paradigm. And if you get enough of these outliers, enough of these things that don't fit in this paradigm, eventually that paradigm is going to have to shift.
So, for example, the geocentric universe.
Right.
I guess that's an example of where it seems to fit. It certainly looks like the sun is moving around the earth, but we see more and more observations that don't fit, and we need to rethink the entire paradigm. Because today, of course, you know, Galileo pointed out, you cannot tell which of two objects is moving unless one's changing speed or direction.
Right. And here's the thing. With the maverick savant, what generally tends to happen is that they answer one phenomenon at a time. They don't take all of them into consideration. And so when you've got someone looking at the spherical Earth, the globe Earth concept, and when these maverick savants look out and say, but it's flat. I see a flat horizon. That is an outlier to them. That is something that is not to them explained by the globe Earth. It is a phenomenon that they can see, that they can understand. And so they see that outlier and they say, aha, I'm going to shift that paradigm because I see this outlier. But it's only one outlier.
Not everybody is Copernicus.
Right.
Not everybody is Einstein.
Everybody
but
is
of course,
Einstein.
Copernicus was extremely educated, extremely read, and we were going to do this, but we didn't have time. We have some quotes from his book, which I was surprised that his De Revolutionibus is snarky. It's funny. He makes fun of Lactantius specifically.
Yeah, but at the same time, his math is wrong. He's got circular orbits, and they do not work as well as Ptolemy's.
Okay, but there were other reasons, I assume, why this became adopted. And of course, if the Earth is stationary and the universe moves, that means these stars are moving much faster than the speed of light.
Right. It takes Kepler and his understanding of the law of planetary motions that it's actually elliptical, that actually makes the heliocentric universe work, or the heliocentric solar system work.
Okay.
So it takes that step. Anyway, going
back. But the point is, our maverick
savants
who seem to think that I can figure, and we've had them all, you know, one of the things, of course, is YouTube.
Right.
Makes it very easy to just set up a camera, whereas before we had crackpots writing books and you had to read them.
Yes. Oh gosh. Can we talk about the biggest crackpot of them all?
Who's that?
Carpenter.
No.
Okay.
That's a separate show. And I think many in our audience know this. This is, of course, a picture of, do you know?
No.
That is the inventor of Burley's phosphorus drink, which was a restorative tonic which cured rheumatism, arthritis. He basically discovered a medical cure. His full name was Samuel Burley Rowbottom. Samuel Burley Rowbottom.
How much opium was in this?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Samuel Burley Rowbottom, for anybody who studies the modern flat earth movement, know that he was basically the first person to basically call himself the maverick savant and create the whole mythos. He went to the Bedford level and allegedly saw the effect of things being... And he basically got to tell... I said basically too often. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
But... the idea of a maverick savant who can look up history and say, hey, Columbus was wrong, the people before him were right. Who gets to tell us our history?
Right. Who gets to have the last word?
And of course,
it's never the last word.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
And of course, Mr. Rowbottom became a public speaking tour. He made a lot of money. He was like a faith healer traveling around telling crazy stories.
And he was able to say common sense over science. Is that common sense in the idea of we all have these common senses: smell, taste, hearing, sight, touch. Thank you.
Quintessence.
Duh.
All right.
Anyway,
Okay.
so,
do you want to
so
give your?
we all have these common senses. We can all see certain things. How difficult is it for people to understand if you look out, it's flat?
Okay, common sense, though, tends to reinforce your own prejudices.
Common sense reinforces your own prejudices.
Because it's just common sense that
Yes.
people who aren't like me
right.
are wrong.
But
It's just common sense.
There was a philosopher in the 18th century named Giambattista Vico. I love this guy, who said common sense is judgment without reflection. Making a judgment based on
I love that one.
bias. What?
I love that one.
Yeah, made on your own judgments made on your own biases with your common senses that actually you have not
It's
reflected.
just common
on.
sense
Yeah.
that homosexuals are child molesters. It's
Right?
just common
It's just-
sense. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not a child molester and I'm not a homosexual. I prove. No, I mean,
No.
common sense.
He's being funny, you guys.
Okay. I think they know that.
Okay.
The point is, common sense doesn't work in the world of science because it's common sense says that the sun comes up in the
Right.
east and sets in the west.
Right.
Common sense certainly says that time moves at the same rate wherever you are in the universe.
Right. But our science has gone beyond common sense. Eratosthenes did his measurements with 2 sticks.
But it's observation.
but
Rather
it's
than common
observation,
sense is basically sitting in Plato's cave.
Right.
Now, and this is why Plato, sitting in his cave, Plato, who did not believe in empiricism,
Right.
Plato came to the conclusion that the earth was round.
Was it right? Yeah. Okay.
Plato did have a round earth. So his common sense still said the earth was round, but the point is making conclusions based on common sense, thinking you are the maverick savant who's going to fix everything, or that Columbus was this maverick savant who bravely convinced the queen that she was wrong and the world was round, and just trust me on this. And everybody was fooled, was proven wrong, and the modern age began. That's just not the way history works.
Right.
So,
The big question, what can and should historians do about the spread of bad history?
well, guess what? You're not going to solve it.
No, this is too big of a question. We're not going to solve it. It's why we see daily videos from all sorts of interesting people on Non Sequitur Show, Red's Rhetoric, Sean Hufford, Fight the Flat Earth, Conspiracy Cats, Simon Dan. I spend way too much time on YouTube. I really do.
Finish your sentence.
But all of these people that are trying to do this science. Our son has a theory that flat earthers aren't really flat earthers. They're trolls. They're pose. They are disgruntled physics professors who all know better, but who want to make sure that all of the people who do understand science are coming up with new ways to demonstrate that the world is round and that the
But people are really
Earth
not
goes around the sun.
vaccinating their children. So there really are people who believe really dumb things. But the issue, we're still getting back to the issue, which is using history to make a point. Now, and our point really isn't about the modern flat earthers. Our point is about the 19th century created this myth that people in the Middle Ages believed in a flat earth, and that they used this to attack the Christians, or mainly the Christians, obviously, and the Catholics specifically. They use this to present themselves as being the brave thing. Now, they were right. They were making valid points. Science is superior to superstition or believing cosmos about anything, including unicorns. But nonetheless, you are spreading misinformation.
Right.
And there's
But a lot of the modern flat Earth movement consider themselves woke. They are red-pilled. They have taken the red pill and their eyes are open. It's very much a shift in consciousness, not actually learning the science and becoming better at it, but just, I'm more conscious than you are. Therefore,
it's just common sense. Okay,
just common
we're getting in the weeds here. And of course, I really don't have time to argue with somebody about the shape of the earth or about very basic stuff like that, whether Washington had wooden teeth,
Right.
whether Vikings had horns on their helmets. They didn't. That we know of. There could have been one. There was Sven.
Okay.
We don't talk about Sven.
Right.
Sven
But
is weird.
history can be used to argue all sorts of nuanced points. Oftentimes, historians will look at the exact same evidence and come to different conclusions. Historians don't always argue that much about events. They argue about why it happened, or how it happened, or what it means to us, or what it meant to them. They're looking at very different problems, and sometimes that's very unsatisfying for the public that wants to, I just want to learn about the Battle of Chickamauga. Chickamauga. Anyway,
I don't know. But the
That's one
point
of
is,
one of the Civil War battles, I believe.
we are still told that most of the people thought the world was flat in Columbus's day, and they did not.
You're not going to play that again.
I might play that again.
Anyway, so the hopefully what we have been able to show tonight is that these myths come and go, that they are based sometimes on evidence, which, as strange as that sounds, it's, cherry picking quotes.
I'm still going to go back to this guy.
Still going to go back to this guy.
Yes. And I know some people may have tuned in late, but basically, Ted Cruz comparing himself to Galileo, who proved that the world was round 150 years after Columbus. Never mind. But the issue is, when we accept the idea, it is accepted scientific wisdom, the earth is flat. It used to be that it is accepted scientific wisdom that the earth is flat, and a heretic was branded as a denier. That is balderdash.
Complete and total balderdash.
And yet, Ted Cruz is not the most charismatic person on many issues, but the point is he's using history, presenting false history to make an inaccurate point. I'm not a scientist, but what I've read and what I've seen indicates that global warming, climate change, probably is a real problem, and that there are things we can and should be doing, and invoking bad history to prove that we shouldn't.
Prove that we should,
This is
to
where
justify the denial.
But the issue here is we have people teaching bad history, and this could kill people.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that's hyper dramatic, but it's true. This could lead to great. If everybody accepts that sort of thing, well, we shouldn't believe in climate change because people believed the world was flat,
right?
When they didn't. Then bad history is contributing to really bad social problems.
Exactly. And so my position as a historian, if they're using history wrong, we need to call them out. Our voices sometimes are not as loud as those people who are using the poor history.
There is
Dinesh D'Souza.
There is a problem, by the way.
Yes.
If you ever talk to a historian, it is very hard to get a straight answer.
Why do you say that?
Almost anything I ask you, you're going to go, well, we think.
Yeah.
And it could be. It seems to suggest, as opposed to if I'm able to say, people thought the world was flat until Galileo.
Wrong.
I know, but I made a definitive statement. All you're saying is, well, actually, nobody in Galileo. Can you prove that nobody in Galileo's time thought the world was flat? Can you prove it?
Absolutely not.
All right, then there you see people in Galileo's time thought.
So anyway,
we are rambling. We are running out of material.
We have run out of material. It's time to bring this to a close. I hope in the future that people who do argue the flat earth can use some of this information, because it's kind of relevant to what you're doing. And I'm looking at certain ones of you out here on YouTube that are fighting the flat earth, who keep getting your history really messed up.
By the way, I love this quote from Sean Carroll. This is why I listen to academics speaking. Nuance is key, but nuance isn't sexy.
Nope.
Well, except in your case.
Anyway.
No, but it's true that we love to say, because of this, this happened.
Right.
Because Columbus bravely defied conventional wisdom. They discovered the New World, which many of the people here didn't think was such a good deal.
Yeah.
That is a separate topic.
Yeah.
But one of the other things is I know that we've been talking for over an hour and a half, which is much longer than we normally do. And
Our
I
apologies.
would encourage, though, to look at the beginning of the show when we show a couple of clips that are kind of amusing and put this in a little
Right.
bit of perspective.
Yeah.
For now, I think we should wrap it up.
Okay.
And let's say thank you very much to our audience who put up with the horrendous technical problems we had at the start.
When we put this up on air, we will definitely edit some of those out, or at least we'll X those,
We'll try.
get rid of them. We'll see what we can do.
And well, we'd welcome suggestions. And again, because people are tuning in later, I'm wondering if 7 o'clock is too early to start.
It might be. If you know of controversies, if you would like us to look into something,
You always say that, and yet I got a whole list we haven't gotten to yet.
I know. Well, hopefully we'll keep doing these things.
We'll see. All
Maybe
right.
not as
if we don't have
often.
the technical problems. All right.
Yeah.
So let's wrap this up then and say thank you
Thank you very much for being here.
and read history carefully. If somebody says X happened, be a jerk. Prove it. All right.
How do you know that?
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good
Good
night.
night.